This is Silicon and Statecraft, Tech Venture Capital and the National Interest. I'm Mitch Herkis. I'm Global Head of Government Affairs for Wiz. And I'm very excited to be joined here by two people I can't imagine anyone more qualified to speak on these issues. We have Chris Inglis, who was the first Senate-confirmed National Cyber Director and Advisor to the President of the United States, as well as a storied career in the National Security Agency, as well as Matt Cronin, who is Senior National Security Advisor for Andreessen Horowitz and has worked both at the White House and in Congress on issues around national security, including the China Select Committee. So very excited to have these men with their background here today. I think it's hard to emphasize how much change there's been around technology and government and that relationship. It's been quite notable lately, but I think, if you look back over the last several presidencies, you've seen tremendous change in this area, and the arc of what it has looked like and become central to some of our key successes as a nation, as well as some of the things that have gone very wrong as well. So it is an interesting topic for us to talk about that arc today, as well as what the future might look like there. And I'm excited to have your all's help kind of making some sense of where we've been and where we're going. So Matt, let's start with you. There are nonstop headlines, as we know, about what the relationship looks like between Silicon Valley and the government. Why don't you kind of do a little bit of a stage setter for us on like what is kind of this broader going on, and like what does that relationship look like today?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mitch, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for showing up. By RSA conference standards, you are all early birds, so I appreciate your attendance. Okay, so that's right. So there's a lot of headlines. Headlines means news, like new, something that is noteworthy, seemingly has not happened before. And if you look at this within the context of our lifetime, our professional lifetime in the past 35 or so years, it's true. This really has not happened before, this deep collaboration between enterprise and state. However, when you zoom out and you look at the entirety of American history, what you'll see is that rather than being an aberration that's never happened before, having private industry and the public sector come together in moments of crisis is actually our playbook. It is how we respond to great challenges, particularly those relating to great power conflict. Even more specifically, against an authoritarian state. You think about an authoritarian state, like say China, they have all tools of national power immediately at their disposal. There is no true private sector. Everything is a resource for them to use and employ against us and our allies. We don't have that natively in our system, and so we have to come together in a voluntary, virtuous, meritocratic collaboration in these moments of crisis to overcome those challenges, to overcome their inherent coordination advantage. And you go back, this goes throughout our history, the American Revolution. What is the end of the Declaration of Independence? They said we pledged our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor to ensure that democracy not only survives, but thrives. And many of those signatories are some of the most successful capitalists of their age. Fast forward more recently, you have the start of World War II. They did the same thing, start of the Cold War, the space race, which in many ways created the modern Silicon Valley we all enjoy today. Every single time in moments of crisis, we came together, we used this playbook. Just to show how one-to-one this is, I'm going to give you a fact pattern, and I'm going to ask you, and I know it is early, but I'm going to ask you to say the name you think of first, right? Okay, so you have an immigrant CEO of the country's most successful automotive company, most innovative automotive company, coming into the White House at the request of the president to reform the government, to make it more efficient, and reform its procurement process, and a bunch of his friends are also coming in from the private sector, taking formal and informal roles. Put out a name. Who am I talking about? Yeah, what I'm actually talking about is William Knudsen, who is the CEO of GM. In 1940, and FDR told him to do exactly that, and he did it. He actually became a 3-star general, helped reform the American government, particularly its military procurement and manufacturing process, and he and his friends are one of the reasons why we succeeded in World War II and then won the century. Now, this is not me telling you that you have to like any particular person who is, at the high end of capitalism. This is not me saying you have to support a Republican platform any more than in the 1940s they should support a Democratic platform, and they did the exact same thing. But it is really important to understand that the public and private sector coming together to face great challenges is not only with precedent, it is essential. And when done correctly, could lead to an incredibly important beneficial outcome for the free world.
So, Chris, I want to kind of go to you
Ditto.
because it has. I mean, it always has not. There's been ebbs and flows, and when it comes to Silicon Valley in particular, for a long time there was a kind of a separation almost. Like there's an apocryphal story. I don't know. Maybe it's a real story that Google didn't invest in a lobbyist even until they were a verb, right? Until Google was a verb. Someone pointed out, your name's a verb. You probably need a lobbyist at some point. But the relationship has been was one of distance for a long time. As you came up through the ranks, how did that distance look, and how did that impact your work?
Yeah, so I'm going to build on Matt's theme a little bit, and I'll go all the way back. I wasn't at the revolution or kind of the late 1770s, but I think it starts there. There was a bias built into our DNA at that moment in time. If you read the Declaration of Independence, which Matt referred to, it essentially says we hate government, right? I mean, you cannot walk away from that without knowing that we somehow want to throw off the shackles of government. They were, of course, talking about King George III, not anyone kind of after that. But that bias was then written into the Constitution, which in the preamble says we aspire to create a nation to achieve these two purposes. But the rest of the Constitution is about checking and balancing government power. So what we set up as the first bias was that we enable, empower the private sector, we constrain the government. The second bias is one that says that government has the instruments of power necessary to conduct statecraft, and the private sector on those crisis moments, as Matt referred to, creates the materiel, the capability to essentially employ those, but in the hands of government. They become the arsenal of democracy. The government owns, operates those tools. As recently as 20 years ago, kind of in the middle of my career when we were doing the global war on terror, it was the government that would find, interdict, kind of challenge terrorists, remove them from the battlefield, and the private sector that did the innovation and all of the technology necessary to say, how do we find them kind of in a world where they can escape and hide in the corners? So that's also a bias, is that the role is one where the private sector supports the government in times of crisis. That's no longer true. The private sector now not simply innovates, deploys, sustains, but defends cyberspace. They're on the front lines of cyberspace. The government needs to consider flipping that script to say that we need to actually supply the private sector with the insights, the material, the authorities necessary to defend themselves, while the government retains those unique authorities to impose consequences. That's still a government role, but that flips the script. I think the third bias is that we kind of, having said all of that, sometime imagine, and neither the private sector nor the public sector is monolithic, but let's imagine for a moment that they are. We sometimes imagine that we're engaged in something that is a division of effort. You do A, I'll do B, because I'm trying to help you solve your problem while you're trying to help me solve my problem. These are not similar problems. This is the same problem. We're actually trying to achieve the same end. Most of us can recall in the summer of 2017 when NotPetya swept across the global networks. Maersk went down hard. This was a Russian attack on the Ukraine in cyberspace. But Maersk went down hard. FedEx in Europe went down hard. And everyone looked at that and said, that's one of those egregious results of the fragility of the digital infrastructure. It was a bad summer to be either a Maersk or a FedEx or kind of a shareholder in those two. But it turns out at that moment in time, if the US Department of Defense had to mobilize resources into Europe to, say, respond to a SNAP exercise that Russia might have done against the Baltics, it couldn't have done it because it's so fundamentally dependent upon the critical infrastructure that's in the private sector for the mobilization of all those resources. So we're all in common dependent on the same infrastructure, and we're all trying to figure out how does it meet our expectations in a world that's hugely challenged. So three things. One, this is a shared proposition, not a division of effort. We need to therefore figure out how we achieve the professional intimacy necessary to actually achieve a common aspiration to get the critical infrastructure to work on our behalf. Economic viability depends upon that. National security depends upon that. Individual aspirations that you want to do in a given day depend upon that. If we're to do that, we then need to kind of walk away from division of effort and say, how do we get into that true collaboration And how do we make it such that we can complement this with the professional intimacy necessary that says we're doing this every day, not just in a crisis?
And just to pull the thread a little bit on the long-term impact there of that kind of division of labor bias, as you kind of put it, I assume that's getting harder and harder with the essence of the underlying technologies, but have you seen, have you seen that thinking become less common lately in the last 5-10 years?
There are pockets of enlightenment, I would say. So here's what traditionally holds us back. We look at digital infrastructure as a commodity, that it is, in some cases, it's simply additive to our business proposition, not an existential underlayment of that. If it's a commodity, we can then outsource it to somebody, say, you take care of this. Right? In most businesses, we say it's the IT shop, or maybe the CIO and the CISO combined. Make that thing work because I'm over here doing business. It is not an optional kind of artifact of business. It's the existential foundation for business. That's equally true for national security. But because we have that bias, we tend to outsource this. We tend to silo this. We tend to assign some resource and some responsibility to somebody besides ourselves. And that's then true when the government and the private sector try to deal with this kind of in some kind of shared relationship, which is that we see this as something that other people do. It's not the responsibility in the boardroom to figure out what our dependence on digital infrastructure is, and therefore to make those investments. And when you then begin to kind of psychologically outsource this and put that somewhere else, it winds up surprising you when you realize that that low probability, high consequence event of your dependence on digital infrastructure has just bitten you in the rear end. So I see a lot more of that. I just make a comment about, I use the term division of effort with malice aforethought. It's actually an agreement to not collaborate. It's this assignment of you do A, I'll do B, and hopefully the seam between us does not move. There's no seam in cyberspace. There's nothing that actually we can say that's a static boundary, that if we assign those responsibilities in that way, they'll work tomorrow in the same way that could have worked today. So we need to take that border down and say, how do we actually kind of share, not just information, but effort and insight so that we can achieve the truest of collaboration, which means that I have to have professional intimacy with you. I need to know what's my dependence on the things that you do, what's your dependence on the things that I do, so that we can then work together to solve the problem. I was in Australia not long ago, and they had this fearsome beast down there called saltwater crocodile, and nobody wants to tangle with one of those things. But I made this analogy. I said, if you've got one end of a saltwater crocodile, and I've got the other end of a saltwater crocodile, why the hell wouldn't we collaborate to do something about that? But that's what we do every day in cyberspace, is we say, you take the right end, I'll take the left end, and no one knows what actually is happening in terms of the middle of that crocodile.
And Matt, I want to kind of pull you back in to talk about this moment now. Mm-hmm. Why is it, do you see this as a moment that relationship matters more or less? What is the Silicon Valley government relationship at this time? Why would it matter now versus this general arc?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with all the great points that Chris made in the cyber realm, and I'll kind of go broader than that. So at the highest level, essentially, we, in the past few years, realized that we are all in a slowly boiling pot, and we need to get out of it. And we all then realized, well, we can't climb out of this pot on our own. We're in a lot of trouble, and so we're starting to work together to find our way out of this problem. There is a Winston Churchill quote I'll probably mess up, but it's like, Americans are great, will always make the right decision after they've completed making all the wrong ones. And I think we've kind of, in that process now, where we kind of screwed around, including in cyberspace, just not working together, not figuring things out, and we're like, oh wow, none of that worked. We actually have to figure this out together now. And to start in cyberspace, the nature of the threat, why this matters more, as Chris was just saying, we as a nation are blessed to have two vast oceans either side and two relatively friendly neighbors north and south of us. And so throughout our history, with rare exception, we've not really had to worry too much about our civilian infrastructure and what could happen to it. We kind of let them do their own thing, and the state, unlike in other countries, they have to think through, well, how do I defend that? How would this work? How would I operate if this doesn't work one day because of an adversary's efforts? Well, in cyberspace, that doesn't exist. The oceans are irrelevant. And so right now, this was in a congressional testimony just last year, Director Easterly, Director Wray, Joan Nakasone, and National Cyber Director Coker, they revealed to the public for the first time previously classified information about how the Chinese government is currently on our networks within our critical infrastructure, water, power, emergency services, oil and gas, transportation. They are there staging solely for the purpose of causing mass casualty events to Americans. So if you were to imagine if you found a bunch of explosives on our bridges, our hospitals, our power plants, and it said courtesy of the PLA on it, what would we do? We can and should completely freak out. Well, that's happening right now in the cyber realm. And this is not a solvable problem with either side working in isolation. We have to grab the saltwater crocodile or the dragon, whatever analogy you want to use, together. And it gets broader than that too. And I think that's to why in Silicon Valley and in the private industry writ large, there is more and more of a realization that we actually need to work together with the federal government, with the democracy side of our democratic capitalist society. And that's because they realize that if they operate independently, eventually they'll get wiped out. And some realize that faster than others. Some are big enough to think that they'll be able to somehow figure this out. But what a lot of folks have realized, and I talked to them, and I'm not going to divulge who it is, but you talk to Fortune 20 companies when I was in the China Select Committee, and they recognize that no company can defeat a superpower. It's impossible. So if you are a multinational corporation based in the United States, the fundamental goal of the Chinese Communist Party is to make sure that you don't exist and that their national champion exists instead and takes your market share. And they use, this is just public information, they use intellectual property theft, they use market tactics, they heavily subsidize, a lot of these national champions will operate at a loss for years and years and years and years and years, just undercutting the pricing. It is a distortion of the capitalist market. And so it doesn't matter what you do. You could be the best CEO in the world, the best product in the world, the best market fit in the world. You won't defeat a superpower. And so they recognize that we have to actually work together to relieve these distortions and make sure that we don't have a situation where, as of right now, you have these choke points. So rare earth refining, legacy semiconductors, solar panels being an example. In the 2010s, we did not step in where national champions came in and wiped out the entirety of the American and European renewable energy market. Same with batteries today. So it won't work, even in the economic side, putting aside military conflict, if we're on our own. We have to work together. And that is why private capital has jumped in as well.
So Mitch, if I might kind of offer kind of a model and a practical example to backstop what Matt has said. So most of us have lived in organizations which have a model that I'm about to describe. Mine comes from the military, but essentially says that two organizations that are in competition with one another, one prevails, the other doesn't, based upon whether one of them can observe a situation, orient to that, figure out what matters, what doesn't, decide to do something, and then act, kind of with ruthlessly efficiency, over and over and over again. The Air Force calls that the OODA loop, but observe, orient, decide, and act over and over and over again. Turns out in cyberspace, nobody owns an intact OODA loop. No one actually is in a position to say, I can observe it, I can orient to it, I can decide to do something about it, I can act on that, because no one possesses all of those capacities. Take the example that Matt put on the table about Volt Typhoon. That almost certainly, kind of in the presence of natural light, we can talk about this, but that almost certainly did not come from the water systems that actually kind of had that malware inside, or the energy grids that had that malware inside. That almost certainly came from a national institution, possibly the National Security Agency, possibly GCHQ, but it came from someone that's authorized to go over that far horizon, understand what the aspirations of China might be, try to figure out where then those come to land kind of in the domestic infrastructure, working possibly with the FBI to say, found it, there it is. Now you've observed it, you need to then orient to that, say, how important is that? You can only do that in collaboration with those critical system operators who say, that's more important than that. You then need to decide what you're going to do about that. Those decisions lie in the hands of the private sector. You then need to act on that, which is largely at the front edge, at the kind of the edge where those systems are built and operated, deployed, defended. Right? If that collaboration doesn't lower the boundaries between those various phases of an OODA loop, we're dead in the water. We're going to be picked off. We'll be defeated at any one of those seams that lies between us. That's the kind of professional intimacy that's required to defeat that sort of action. But we need to go further, which is to not simply respond to the initiative of an aggressor like China, but rather to establish our own initiative to say we're going to create resilience, We're going to stoutly defend the system that then results, and we will then be able to detect the incursions into that, which are now minimized because we're a harder target in the first place. We're harder to beat in the second place. And in the third place, if we find you, we will interdict you and evict you. Turns out the Ukrainians have done that reasonably well. If you look at how they've actually fought Russia to more than a standstill in cyberspace, they did it by making modest investments in their technical infrastructure, things that everyone in the room would know about, segmentation and redundancy, kind of clouds that replace what might be perhaps on-prem data centers and so on and so forth. Two, they have world-class expertise such that if somebody says to them, whether it's China or Russia, I'm going to live off the land, meaning I know your architecture better than you will. I will use your tools and my better knowledge of your architecture to defeat you. The Ukrainians have said, not here, not today, not anywhere. And that requires a coalition of the providers, the co-defenders of the private sector, and the Ukrainians who actually are operating that infrastructure. And that's the third thing they've done, is they've built a coalition, not a division of effort, but a true coalition where the co-defenders get together and they challenge Russia implicitly by saying, you've got to beat all of us to beat one of us. And they don't become co-combatants, they're co-defenders. And they're on the right side then of the rule of law. I think we need to do something similar in a world where we're the boiling frog in that pot of water, and we've got to get out of that darn thing, but ultimately figure out how do we collaborate going forward.
And just speaking of collaboration, like I want to put two things out there. One, I had the privilege of getting to work with you a little bit while you were in government, and you would often to say to folks like me, you want to be so helpful that they can't imagine life without us. I'd like to kind of hear a little bit more about that, and maybe if you could also touch on what your cyber social contract that you proposed.
Yeah, well, let me go back to that statement that you made. I'm glad you heard that. I'm not sure I always said that. Look, a collaboration requires certain things, right? First, you have to have a shared problem. We have a shared problem, right? So that's a given, right? The private sector, the public sector, we're not trying to solve similar problems. To our earlier points, it's the same problem. Two, you need to have some degree of professional intimacy in approaching that problem, meaning that both sides need to be sufficiently close that they can see what they're actually trying to do, and they can observe, you've asked me the wrong question, I've offered you the wrong information. This, given now I've seen what you're trying to do, is what I can give you that you would never have known to ask me about, nor would I've known was valuable to you because I didn't know before what the heck you were doing. That professional intimacy is absolutely essential. That's best built in a face-to-face kind of context. It can be sustained at a distance, but you have to get close enough where you can say, let's stop asking questions of one another. Let's stop letting data do the work. Let's do the work. Let's actually do the work. And the third thing that it requires is infrastructure. Where are you going to meet, under what circumstances, what data sets you're going to use. That ultimately is used as a substitute for the first two. Let's not do that. But my point about saying, let's make them say that, wow, I can't believe how generous you are, is that in any collaboration, somebody needs to go first, right? Now, I'm a fan of what's called the Five Eyes intelligence relationship. I spent most of my life in it. But the start of that intelligence relationship in 1940, I wasn't there either, but the start of that relationship was essentially a declaration by both Churchill and Roosevelt to their respective intelligence teams to meet at a place called Bletchley Park, and both sides gave the same direction. Go meet with them, and do not give them anything until they give you something first. It was essentially an order to play Go Fish. And what history records is that both sides ruthlessly ignored those instructions. The Germans made the mistake of shooting the Americans as they were making their way down from the port. So the Americans felt like they had a kindred cause with their British counterparts. And the Brits recorded that the Americans shared things that they hadn't asked about and that the Americans didn't know was valuable to the Brits. It was a kind of unconditional sharing of information. When you get to that place, all of a sudden you're in a place where the fire ignites and you do things together that no one can do alone. So in this present day and age, which of us is going to go first? And in the White House, we were arguing the government needs to go first. The government has unique and valuable information. It's only actionable if it's given to the actor. In this OODA loop concept that I talked about, we're not that actor, right? So we need to push it across the table to the private sector, despite the fact that there's some risk in doing that the adversary might know something about that, or you might actually tell them something about your means and methods of acquiring that information. Just like the old Doritos commercial, right? You eat those, I'll go make more, right? So we get on the front balls of our feet and install a little bit of dynamism in this thing. We can actually seize the initiative, and they then have to respond to us. That's what I think I was arguing for.
So Matt, earlier you kind of mentioned, China's approach is to take all things within their arsenal, and obviously we are not China in many different ways. We, we have a different approach to things, whether it be from a government standpoint, a cultural standpoint, what have you. What is our version of bringing, the arsenal of democracy, so to speak, to the forefront look like when it comes to technology?
Yeah, sure. And I'll start with the cyber side and do a much worse job than Chris, and then I'll branch out. And so, on the cyber side, China, people would say, like, man, like China, like they're so effective in cybersecurity. How do they make it work? It's like, yeah, listen, if you are a country where there is no right to privacy, no right to property, you can go on anyone's network at any given time, spy on anyone whenever you want. You suspect someone of hacking, you can have a van come over, put a bag over the head, and drive them away. Like, you have other problems, right? There are other deeper problems in your society, but you probably will have an easier time in cybersecurity. So we don't want that outcome. We don't want to get that point, whether in the cybersecurity realm or any other realm. Because as I noted at the start, that creates a whole host, aside from just being a horrendous abuse of human rights, it creates a whole host of other problems inherent to their system, which makes them unstable and makes them very vulnerable. So we want to maintain our strengths while also leveraging, minimizing, I should say, our weaknesses in terms of our otherwise lack of coordination. So there, the way I think about it is we want to create a shared mission. There has to be an understanding in the private sector, and I think we are getting there with some notable exceptions, that, listen, you have to understand, as a company, a multinational or otherwise, if you fundamentally are an American company or within the Allied West, you need the United States and the West not only to survive, but thrive in order for you to succeed. If you care at all for something more than 2 or 3/4 of profits, you cannot go and make these agreements where you give away your intellectual property, where you make these different JV licensing agreements to get access to a market temporarily, give up critical information about your company. If you essentially allow, like in some cases, literally allow communist cells into your company in order to operate in China, as one example, and similar things happened in Russia, well then, you can't do those things. It's bad for you in the long run, but you're also undermining the fundamental security interests of the free world. And in doing so, you are allowing all of us eventually to be defeated, which means that your children's children will live in a much worse world. At the same time, as part of that shared mission, the government has to create a series of incentives so that, at the very least, those who join them on this mission, who make choices that are not necessarily always in the best interest of a quarter's profit, have an opportunity for greater profit in the long term than those who do not. And that just comes down to basic incentive structures that can be, grants, awards, tax incentives, offtake agreements. There's many levers we can pull throughout the federal government, for the Development Bank, the Ex-Im, Treasury, everything. There's many different assets we can use and take advantage of it. Well, the thing that I'll note is that, you go back to that earlier issue of national champions, the government also has to take some steps, and it already has. Huawei's a notable example. BYD in the Biden administration is another one, where we understand that there's a distortion in the market. We are not allowing capitalism when we let national champions into our market. We're in fact inhibiting it and distorting it. And just only the government can address those sorts of threats with the appropriate tools. So it again requires both sides to come together, recognize a shared mission, and move ahead in good faith. Not just come over and say, what do you want, what do you want, and just try to find a way to get to do minimal cooperation and then walk away not trusting. There has to be, as Chris mentioned, that Bletchley Park moment where you say, listen, here's these problems, here's the things that are bothering us, like this is a real issue, we can't fix it on our own. And the other side, vice versa, does the same thing. That requires going out and trusting people, perhaps when you're not accustomed to it. Again, generationally, we've not ever done that. But once you start doing and developing that trust, I think you will see on both the public and private sector, there are huge amounts of huge number of good faith actors who really want to help. They want our corporations to succeed in the government, and they want the U.S. national security interests to prevail in the private sector. It's just there has to be that fundamental trust and meeting of the minds.
Okay, maybe this is a good time to kind of shift into your current roles, right? And how you all approach this from the venture
Private
capital
citizen.
side.
Yeah.
Private citizen.
Writer trustee.
But looking at the capital side of it, the venture capital side, when Paladin is looking at this, what kind of philosophies do they take from this discussion into their investment?
Well, Matt just ran through a series of values, right, that said how should we as participants in this capitalistic society where the flow of monies to purposes is something that should, have certain qualities associated with that. We should not simply pursue profit, but we should at the same time make sure that we're aiding and abetting the system that allowed us to pursue that in the first place. How do we do that in a way that does not cede the advantage to those who would hold us at risk? Those are values, right? And Paladin and a number of other venture firms have signed on voluntarily to what's called the kind of the principles of trusted investment, which essentially just is an alliteration of those. Right? We will not take money from those institutions, might be the Chinese government, the Russian government, others, whose aim as a government is to suppress the individual liberties, the privacy, right? The benefits of a free and open society. We will not give away intellectual property to those who would then abuse it, use it to abuse their people or other peoples, plural. They have every right to conduct their nation states the way they want and the way they see fit, so long as that's a compact between their people and their government. But we're not going to aid and abet kind of systems that are kind of antithetical to our own. But anyway, when you read out all of those principles, a number of investment firms have signed on to those so that you can then propagate those, not just in terms of how you spend the capital at the top of that pyramid, but how you then invest in companies who kind of similarly apply those principles all the way downstream. And it's not simply the right thing to do, it's the sensible thing to do, because the system that actually allowed for all of this kind of capital advantage that we have, the flourish of initiative and the audacity that lives in places like RSA, is fragile. Right? It's not guaranteed that that will persist for all time. There's that classic anecdote where Henry Kissinger went to China in 1971 to open the door for Nixon, who went in 1972. But in talking to his counterpart, Chou En-lai, and trying to open up an open-ended discussion, Chou En-lai was having nothing of it. Kissinger finally resorted to reading the guy's bio, and it said that he'd studied at a French university, he'd studied the French Revolution, and Kissinger said to him, so you studied at a French university and you studied the French Revolution, so what do you think? And the response in 1971 was, it's too soon to tell. Which that's not really a kind of a sense of what the long arc of Chinese thinking is. It was a statement by a Chinese policy official that says, I don't think democracy is the end game, right? There's a competition between these two systems. And if the participants who are essentially in charge of innovation within a society and the deployment of that innovation in the systems upon which our health, our lives, our economic vitality depend, don't help defend that proposition, then we're lost.
Do you want to build on that, Matt? Talk a little bit about how Andreessen approaches these things and thinks about this broader investment strategy and what it means for our nation.
Yeah, sure. So I give huge credit to Mark and Ben, similar to Paladin Capital, where years ago they made a decision where almost every other venture capital and PE firm was going out and investing heavily in China, to a lesser extent Russia. They decided not to. They said, first off, as a matter of business, they realized, I don't think that capital is actually getting out of there. I think it's just that's just like money on a ledger but not actually seen. I think that's, if you really look into the details, that has been proven true time and again for many of these firms that technically make a profit in China, but there's very tight capital restrictions, and oftentimes money doesn't actually ever leave China. But second, they made the decision because they realized that's antithetical to their institution and to what they think are the interests of their country. So rather than investing in Chinese military companies or companies that assist in the genocide in Xinjiang, they instead invested in what they would be now called the American dynamism practice. Back when it was extraordinarily unpopular to do so, they put a lot of cold hard cash behind ventures like Anduril, SpaceX as well, Saronic, Shield AI, and then not just defense tech companies, but also companies that are devoted to public safety. Like how do we ensure that our communities within the rule of law and the bounds of the Constitution can be more safe and secure, more prosperous? Not only that, also education, manufacturing, logistics, all these things that I think we now as society recognize there's a huge deficit in that we really need to fix. And what America is best at is to go and innovate, to find novel solutions, not to stay to the same old tired path. And we see our role at Andreessen Horowitz is to find the best founders, to find the best products, the best product market fit, and just give them an opportunity to renew the United States, renew the society of the United States and its allies, to lead to that better future.
And with the disclaimer that this is not investment advice or career advice, where do you see, both of you, kind of the areas that are ripe for investment when it comes to this partnership?
Okay, so
What technologies?
Yeah,
what
yeah.
areas?
I will speak to the following stocks. No, I'm just kidding. So this is not investment advice. Don't invest in. I'm not talking about meme coins. I'm just talking broad trends. So I would say, in general, just to elaborate on the last point I made, what you're seeing right now, for those of you keeping track in DC, is a real movement to fundamentally transform the defense industrial base and to bring it back to really what it was more like when we were winning at astounding levels in terms of production, manufacturing, innovation during and after World War II into the start of the Cold War. And so I would say looking a little over the horizon, seeing the sort of problems that we need to address. So we'll start with the defense one first. We're going to be probably irrelevant to everyone here, but maybe you find it interesting. So right now, the U.S. built a system, built a defense industrial base and a military focused on highly exquisite, expensive systems, F-35, aircraft carriers, et cetera. And those play a role, and they're really important. At the same time, our adversaries created an asymmetric system designed solely to defeat our exquisite systems. So an anti-carrier missile for our supercarriers would be one of many examples. So a bunch of drones instead of an F-35. So now what we're seeing is we're starting to see a counter to that counter, where we are focusing on highly attritable systems, and systems that can do so in an environment that would otherwise be locked out due to electronic warfare. And those are the sorts of things we need. So Andrew would be a key example, Shield AI another example, Saronic another example, where, for instance, if the PRC, the PLA needs to cross the Taiwan Strait, now they designed a system to defeat very large naval vessels. Those naval vessels play a key role. We still need them. But what if instead there are tens of thousands of submersible and surface maritime drones with munitions, so that rather than they spend X million dollars to destroy our billions of dollars carrier, now we are spending under $1 million to take out a $10 million craft. So even though their shipbuilding is superior to us, again, we need to fix it, we now have the advantage in terms of the cycle. So that's one area. Another area where I think there's a huge potential would be in manufacturing. This is not for any one administration. It is really a matter of necessity for us to bring back key manufacturing and key industries. That doesn't mean that we need to make socks here, for instance, but there are critical industries where we need to make sure that there are no choke points that prevent us from prospering as a society. So rare earth refining, batteries, these are all examples. They're not necessarily military in nature. APIs for pharmaceuticals is another one. We need to have the capacity of providing essential services to our communities, but also essential ingredients to our companies so that they can manufacture and make and do all the things that make them incredible. So it's just really just focusing on these key building blocks. And I'll go into cybersecurity too, but I know Chris is going to get into that, so I won't get ahead of him. But that's another key area where right now we have to get to the point that we can create those digital oceans, which we enjoy in the physical realm, in the cyber realm as well, so people realize we can't get after them. Their systems are so fundamentally secure, whether it's through AI processes or otherwise, another huge area of potential growth. We can't get through to them. We cannot successfully take down their water systems. We cannot hold them at risk. And once you do that, then you have deterrence. And fundamentally, our job here is to prevent conflict. Is to be sure that we are prosperous and that we deter a conflict so they think, every day they wake up and they say, not today. We can't do that today. We can't go after them. And that means they can no longer hold us at risk in the commercial and the military realm.
Yeah. Some cyber companies here may see SOCs as a critical industry. Given away
I mean
everywhere.
SOCs,
But-
S-O-C-K-S.
No, I meant I did too, because they give them away everywhere.
They give them away, that's true, yeah.
Or
No.
t-shirts.
Chris,
Actually,
yeah.
I very much enjoy that. That was an excellent kind of reprise of the foundational building blocks of the systems upon which our health, our lives, our aspirations must depend, will depend in the United States and like-minded nations. This is an international effort. I would go a little bit further to say that any system of interest that would be kind of interest because it provides something of value is not simply comprised of the technology, which I think your kind of context is excellent, but it's also comprised of an assignment of roles, responsibilities, and expectations, like who's accountable for what in the system so that all of its various facets can be accounted for. That might be called doctrine, and the skills of the people who actually use it, employ it, deploy it, and possibly are on the first line of defense for it. I think as I see the rapid change of technology, transformative technologies, whether it's generative AI or quantum computing, or you fill in the blank of what's coming next, there is a huge focus on how do we get the technology building blocks right, but there needs to be an equally or greater focus on the relationship of that to the human proposition, and perhaps kind of a still greater focus on the human being. Humans remain the accountable party. Human remains kind of where you are going to assert your critical thinking skills. And the thing I worry about is that we will substitute human thinking or human accountability with machines, and that will be dangerous. Right? And so if I was to invest in one technology above all others going forward, it would be in the gray matter, kind of that's kind of between the ears of how do we get our kids to think critically, because we cannot prepare them for all the specific situations they'll find themselves in. So they need to have a very solid understanding of what human accountability is. They need to have a solid understanding of the values of the society, and an ability to make choices in the face of overwhelming situations that say, oh, no, I'm still in control of this thing. I still understand what it is I'm supposed to do. And so we talk about human on the loop, human out of the loop, autonomous systems. I don't worry about sentience in these systems. I worry about autonomy in these systems, where the thing that we've actually unleashed kind of can decide to change sides in the middle of a war. So the human accountability must remain on the loop, and critical thinking skills are going to be at the core of that. So we need to make sure in any development of some piece in the larger system that we never forget the context of that and the human piece of that, which is always going to be the part that's most important.
I want to add on to that, if you don't mind, actually.
Yeah,
this is a
please.
total aside at this point, but it's really important. So a couple of years ago, I was in Europe helping some allies on some various issues. And one of the things that I learned is that all the nations in the world, the nation that is the most capable at dealing with cybersecurity and disinformation is the nation of Finland. So I reached out, and I talked to these folks, who are amazing, by the way, for any Finns in the room. And so, and I asked the heads of their various cyber disinformation was like how do you do it? Like what can you do? I said, well, I'm not gonna do a Finnish accent because I'll do a bad job. But they said, well, what we do is starting in preschool, we teach our children critical thinking. And I said, okay, what can we do that's faster than that? And they had no solution. But that's really what it comes down to, is that this is a nation of a democracy, truly constantly sees themselves at risk. They have a 1,000-mile border with Russia. Russia invaded them. They fought the Winter War. They fought the Soviets, the Nazis, everybody else. They came out of that, with their country intact. On the physical world, they keep stockpiles of food and ammunition. They were one of the only countries not to demilitarize during the globalization false peace. And in that cognitive realm, they realize our society has to remain sharp at all times. Because if we don't, if we let our children grow up in a world where who knows what, who cares about anything, who knows what's real, don't teach them critical thinking, our kids will fall for anything. They'll fall for Russian propaganda. They'll get the cyber attacks into our systems, and we'll lose. And we have to have that same level of dedication to our education. Now, I want to be very clear. That does not mean indoctrination. That does not mean that one political party or the other should say that our children must have these political focused beliefs. But there do have to be a doctrinal foundational belief in the basics of our society, which goes to free expression, rule of law, but also critical thinking. Democracy only works if voters are informed. We have to make sure that starting from a young age, our voters are capable of informing themselves. We cannot educate them on every fact pattern that will come up. We can educate them to understand fact patterns and get to the ground truth on them.
So I want to pull this a little bit back to the technology side.
Fine, not Finland anymore.
I love this conversation, but having been in government and now with a company that has had explosive growth in cybersecurity.
Congratulations, by the way. He works for Wiz.
Yeah, they're wonderful. The founders deserve all the credit. I just get to ride along and watch the magic.
Yeah.
But this is what I would say. government has a hard time adapting to new technology, bringing it in, and being at the right time, right place with it. How do we reduce some of that friction that happens and get them early? They're never going to be the bleeding edge adopter, and I would argue, nor should they be. But except for in some select cases, perhaps around national security, where that moment needs to happen, and they are the investor. But more broadly speaking, there's a lot of ideas out there that will make government better, could make government better. How do we reduce some of the friction so that adoption can happen easier, and those ideas can get in the door quicker?
Well, I think this is a problem broadly across not just the public sector, which is notorious for that, but the private sector as well. The UK did a study about a year and a half ago that said, we've taken a hard look at generative AI and how it's being used by the attackers and the defenders. Probably not a surprise, the attackers were about a year ahead. Because the attackers said, we're going to use this today, right? And the individual ability of somebody in that ecosystem to say, I don't need anybody's permission. I'm not going to take this to a standards board, the compliance board. I'm not going to do any of that stuff. I'm just going to start using it, because if it has a wild effect, that might be a feature, right? And so the attack is way ahead in that regard. The defenders are inherently conservative, and that's not a bad thing, but they're conservative to a fault, which is we have to understand all of the capabilities associated with this. We have to understand what it can do that we don't want. We have to understand the conditions under which it will do what we do want. And we have to run it through perhaps some kind of cycles to understand, under what circumstances do we deploy this and how. And they're typically a year or two behind, right? So how do we actually get to kind of the front balls of our feet as opposed to kind of like a rear guard reactive action? Take the attacker's kind of view, which is, let's seed some of this initiative to the edge, right? Let's give the individual users an opportunity to say, I will make a choice as to how I use this, but also apply some accountability and some safeguards around that to say, you're accountable to make sure that it actually meets the following conditions. And if you can do that, and if there are then some perhaps compensating controls around that would mitigate the damage that's done if this thing doesn't work as intended, right, then we can stop that. Now, that might be kind of bottoms up, not something that actually scales well. It might be inefficient in terms of a corporate outlay of capital. So there needs to be something that then can identify that, do the tech transfer as quickly possible into the main place. But most of what I think is faulted here is that we don't actually use this stuff to actually then in the kind of the realm of real experience say, this is worthwhile, let's make use of this, now let's quickly move this to the center. It's all a theory until you get to the moment you're about to deploy this at scale out to the enterprise, and it happens far too slowly for us to keep pace with an attacker that's coming at us at a much, much more aggressive speed.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And I would say I would gently push back on the idea that government can never be fast. I think what happens with government, and it's true for anyone who works in a large institution, is that you just get bureaucratic and ossified, and the systems are in place that don't make sense. I'll give you an example. I was talking to a good friend of mine who's at the FBI, and this person is leaving to go to the private sector to a really great cyber company. And she goes to the FBI as part of her departure process. She's like, hey, listen, I convinced this company they have all this incredible intelligence about cyber threats that I know that we don't have. I convinced them to literally hand it over to the Bureau, and you can use it. This is great. How do I do it? And then the ethics person says, you absolutely cannot do that. Like, wait, what? Why? It's like, well, that would be an ethics violation for you to provide the FBI information because you work at the FBI. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, there's nothing of value. The company's getting nothing. They're giving you something. It's like, you can't do it. It's against the rules. It's like, well, can I give it to the NSA? Yeah, you can give it to the NSA. Can I give it to ODNI? Yeah. Could I give it to like a foreign ally? Yeah, that's not a problem. Can I give it to the Chinese? You could do that. But just don't give it to the FBI. And that's just one of many examples where it makes no sense. Like, we just have these systems in place because someone did something wrong years ago, like, we'll add a rule here, and then kind of thoughtlessly follow these rules that don't have any purpose anymore in our modern age. Obviously, some do, but a good many do not. And so I'm still in the process of studying this now, but to go to the idea that the government can be fast, just like any institution can learn to be fast. I was looking into how NASA eventually accomplished what many would consider a technological miracle, right? Putting a man on the moon in the time frame they did was unbelievable. To do that, they had to literally force the creation of technologies, including semiconductors that we all rely on today. One of the things NASA did is they came in and they removed the entirety of middle management. And they said, okay, we have engineers, we have the people who are strategic, and there's no one in the middle to act as filters. And that allowed them, and they also were okay with failure. So they just allowed, there's repeated failures, things blew up, things went bad. but in that adopting that really startup sort of mentality, saying, I accept failure, I accept risk, I accept that this structure is going to be flattened out and people in the middle management won't be having those jobs anymore, they can go someplace else. That allowed them to perform, again, a technological miracle. And if government can do that in the 1960s, we certainly can do that today. We just have to have the will to do so.
So Matt, that's a really good example. If I could build on that, I was actually alive during the space program. I remember it. I took second grade math because of the space program.
Yeah.
I was convinced that having passed first grade math, I should take second grade math, which I thought was a sin against humanity because I passed. And they said, but you're helping the space program. Right? So if
There
you
you
take
go.
second grade math. But nonetheless, the other thing that they did was they had short horizon goals in the context and in the bandwidth of a long horizon aspiration. And so there was, the Redstone program, and then the Gemini program, and then the Apollo program, none of which could get to the moon and back, all of which were the building blocks. And so they said, what are we going to do in the next 90 days that is achievable, and actually we can put that benefit kind of in the foundation, and then on that foundation we build the next thing and the next thing. When you build a large system and you turn it on at the end and you hope that it works, it never does. All you hear is some groan in the middle of that thing. So kind of move quickly, kind of have short-term goals in a long-term context, fail fast, and to your point, remove that middle portion, which is always trying to do noble work, but the noble work they wind up doing is slowing it down and actually kind of removing the ability to do tech transfer at a rapid rate.
Yes, Brad.
All right. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. We're at time. We'll be in the back of the room for questions that might come up, but we have to end there. So thank you all for coming today. Thank you both
Thanks
for
a lot.
these
Thanks,
insights.
Mitchell.
Thanks, guys.